Hello friends, today I am going to talk about William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth is the greatest poet and priest of nature. He was born on April 7th, 1770 in the Lake District. He has written approximately 500 sonnets. In 1807, he published 2 volumes of poems which represent the fine flower of his genius. His most popular lyrics are The Solitary Reaper, The Greek Linnet, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Poems in the philosophical strain are Ode on the Intimations of Immortality, Resolution and Independence, Ode to Duty. Then Tinton Abbey, The Sparrow's Nest, My Heart Leaps Up, To the Cuckoo, Character of the Happy Warrior, etc. Wordsworth's sonnets are broadly divided into 6 groups: political sonnets, miscellaneous sonnets, sonnets on the river Duddon, a celestial sonnets, sonnets of Scottish life, and there are some sonnets among memorials of a tour to Italy. Wordsworth is essentially a poet of nature. He was called a priest of nature. Wordsworth is the high priest of nature, and the poetry of nature finds its most sublime and sustaining expression in his works. Wordsworth's delight in nature wasn't confined, like the pre Romantic poets, to the mere external manifestation of varied charms of nature, but he went a step higher than they to represent nature as a mystical force capable of enlightening and ennobling the human soul and mind. In nature, Wordsworth was less concerned with the sensuous manifestation that delight most of our nature poets than the spiritual that he finds underlying these manifestations. His great contribution to the poetry of nature doesn't lie in the fact that he could get accurate and closely observed pictures of nature, but it was the delight and spiritual glory that made him a better teacher. As Wordsworth says, one impulse from the vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil, and of good than all the stages can. But it doesn't mean that Wordsworth spiritualized nature in the very beginning of his career. There are 3 stages in Wordsworth's treatment of nature. The spiritual tone of his appreciation of nature was not a continued process from the days of his childhood to the days of maturity. It gradually became. His attitude towards nature may be classified under 3 heads: the period of the blood, the period of the senses, and the period of the imagination and the soul. Now, let's talk about the first stage of his poetry, that is called the period of the blood. Wordsworth's youth and formative years of life were spent in the midst of nature's beautiful surroundings. In the very first stage, his love for nature was without any mystical or spiritual touch. His love for nature was a healthy boy's love of the open air and the freedom of the fields. In his youth, he was attracted by the physical beauty of nature, and he haunted the hills and the vales for the sake of snaring birds, hunting, and enjoying the lovely spectacles of nature's varied life. He cared at this stage for the coarser pleasure of boyish days and glad animal moments. In the first period, he loved nature with a passion which was all physical without having any tinge of intellectual or physical association. He bounded over the mountains like a roe. I quote, in youth, from rock to rock I went, from hill to hill in discontent, of pleasure high and turbulent, most pleased when most uneasy. So, this is the first stage of his love for nature, which was merely physical. In the second stage, which is called the period of the senses, it was the age of sweet sensations. The poet was thrilled and enchanted by the sights and sounds of nature. Referring to the boyish delights of this period, when he viewed nature with a physical passion, he writes in Tinton Abbey, "The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountains, and the deep gloomy woods, their color and their forms were then to me an appetite, a feeling, and a love." In the third stage, which is called the period of the imagination, his attitude towards nature changed completely, as he has expressed in his beautiful poem, Nutting. In the poem, the poet describes the circumstances under which a change came in his approach to nature. The poet was returning home in the early dawn. He has destroyed beautiful aspects of nature while he was throwing stones, disturbing the serenity and peace of the lovely layers of nature. Suddenly, an idea flashed through his mind that he was unnecessarily hurting nature and perhaps molesting the spirit of the tree. At once he stopped the hurling of stones and fell in a mood of rumination, feeling subtly and imperceptibly the soul of nature hurt by his fiendish delight. Something mystical touched him, and from henceforth started the period of spiritualistic interpretation of nature. The poet began to consider himself as a dedicated spirit, and the great mission of his life now became to preach the gospel and the secret message of nature to humanity, torn by the ravages of present life, ravages of the French Revolution. This is called the third and the mature stage of life. He began to find in the objects of nature a soul and a living spirit. It was in this period that his physical and the sensuous appreciation of nature took the form of a spiritual and mystical appreciation of the inner spirit of nature. He now begins to see in nature, I quote, "a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things." Now Wordsworth could feel the presence of God coloring all the objects of nature, investing them with a celestial light, a light that never was on sea or land. He finds him in the shining of the stars, him H capital God. It means he was able to see God in all the aspects of nature. He could feel him in the flowering of the fields. This immenseness of God in nature gives him mystical visions. He finds nature as a physical expression of the divine being. I quote, "In all things, in all natures, in the stars, this active principle abides. From link to link, it circulates the soul of all the worlds." In Tinton Abbey, he writes beautifully, I quote, "I have felt a presence that disturbs me with joy, of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime, of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is in the light of the setting sun, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things." Unquote. The whole of the universe becomes for the poet permeated by one life. One soul has 1,000 manifestations of nature. The Spirit of God is there in the hills and the vales, in the setting of the sun. Wherever the poet could go, he has found the Spirit of nature dwelling everywhere. He endows each and every object of nature with the beauty of God. He says that modern man is lost only because he has lost touch with nature. Whatever is ours, we fail to see the glory of nature. The poet reiterates his faith in the presence of life, in the objects of the nature in his poem, The Soul of All the Words. I quote, "To every form of being is assigned an active principle. It lives. It is because that every object of nature has life. It can feel pleasure or pain like ordinary human beings when pricked or tickled. This faith of poet is echoed in the oft quoted lines, and it is my faith that every flower enjoys the air it breathes." Wordsworth, throughout his life, remained a true interpreter of nature to humanity. I quote Matthew Arnold: "Nature not only gave him the matter, but wrote his poems for him." Wordsworth was a true worshipper of nature, her true priest, and a revealer of her harmonies to humanity. His attitude towards nature remained that of a devout worshipper, prostrating before the sights and scenes of nature in the spirit of supplication, reverence, and worship. He considered nature as the external garb of God. I quote, "Wisdom and spirit of the universe, the soul, that art of eternity of thought, that gives to forms and images a breath and everlasting motion." He remained to the last, as he says in Tinton Abbey, a lover of the meadows and the woods and mountains, of all the mighty world of the eye and ear, well pleased to recognize in nature and language of the sense the anchor of my purest thought, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul, and of all my moral being. Wordsworth was indeed the greatest poet and priest of nature ever born on this earth. There are many poets who have written about nature. There are many who have always praised the outer beauty of nature, but it was only Wordsworth who could see the inner beauty and the spiritual aspect of nature. Thank you.